Eliza bustled around doing useless things with an eager matter-of-factness, and Eugene, choked with exasperation at one moment because of her heavy optimism, was blind with pity the next when he saw the terrible fear and pain in her dull black eyes. He rushed toward her suddenly as she stood above the hot stove and seized her rough, worn hand, kissing it and babbling helplessly. "Oh, Mama, Mama, it's all right, it's all right, it's all right." And Eliza, stripped suddenly of her pretenses, clung to him, burying her white face in his coat sleeve, weeping bitterly, helplessly, grievously for the sad waste of the irrevocable years, the immortal hours of love that might never be relived, the great evil of forgetfulness and indifference that could never be righted now. Like a child, she was grateful for his caress, and his heart twisted in him like a wild and broken thing, and he kept mumbling, "It's all right, it's all right, it's all right," knowing that it was not, could never be all right. "If I had known, child, if I had known," she wept, as she had wept long before at Grover's death. Then, over the ugly clamor of their dissension, over the rasp and snarl of their nerves, they heard the low mutter of Ben's expiring breath. The light had been reshaded. He lay, like his own shadow, in all his fierce, gray, lonely beauty. And as they looked and saw his bright eyes already blurred with death, and saw the feeble beating flutter of his poor thin breast, the strange wonder, the dark, rich miracle of his life surged over them its enormous loveliness. They grew quiet and calm. They plunged below at the splintered wreckage of their lives. They drew together in a superb communion of love and valiance, beyond horror and confusion, beyond death. And Eugene's eyes grew blind with love and wonder. An enormous organ music sounded in his heart. He possessed them for a moment. He was a part of their loveliness. His life soared magnificently out of the slough of pain and ugliness. He thought, that was not all. That really was not all. Helen turned quietly to Coker, who was standing in shadow by the window, chewing upon his long, unlighted cigar. "Is there anything more you can do? Have you tried everything? I mean, everything?" Her voice was prayerful and low. Coker turned toward her slowly, taking the cigar between his big stained fingers. Then, gently, with his weary yellow smile, he answered, "Everything. Not all the king's horses, not all the doctors and nurses in the world can help him now." "How long have you known this?" she said. "For 2 days," he answered. "From the beginning." He was silent for a moment. "For 10 years," he went on with growing energy, "since I first saw him at 3 a.m, in the greasy spoon with a donut in one hand and a cigarette in the other." "My dear, dear girl," he said gently, as she tried to speak, "we can't turn back the days that have gone. We can't turn life back to the hours when our lungs were sound, our blood hot, our bodies young. We are a flash of fire, a brain, a heart, a spirit, and we are 3 cents worth of lime and iron, which we cannot get back." He picked up his greasy black slouch hat and jammed it carelessly upon his head. Then he fumbled for a match and lit the cigar. The only sound in the room now was the low rattling mutter of Ben's breath. He no longer gasped. He no longer gave signs of consciousness or struggle. His eyes were almost closed. Their gray flicker was dulled, coated with the sheen of insensibility and death. He lay quietly upon his back, very straight, without sign of pain, and with a curious upturned thrust of his sharp, thin face. His mouth was firmly shut. Already, save for the feeble mutter of his breath, he seemed to be dead. He seemed detached. No part of the ugly mechanism of that sound, which came to remind them of the terrible chemistry of flesh, to mock at illusion, at all belief in the strange passage and continuance of life. He was dead, save for the slow running down of the worn-out machine, save for that dreadful mutter within him of which he was no part. He was dead. But in their enormous silence, wonder grew. They remembered the strange, flitting loneliness of his life. They thought of 1,000 forgotten acts and moments, and always there was something that now seemed unearthly and strange. He walked through their lives like a shadow. They looked now upon his gray, deserted shell with a thrill of awful recognition, as one who remembers a forgotten an enchanted word, or as men who look upon a corpse and see for the first time a departed God. And Eliza, now that he could deny her no longer, now that his fierce bright eyes could no longer turn from her in pain and aversion, sat near his head beside him, clutching his cold hand between her rough, worn palms. She did not seem conscious of the life around her. She seemed under a powerful hypnosis. She sat very stiff and erect in her chair, her white face set stonily, her dull black eyes fixed upon the gray, cold face. They sat waiting. Midnight came. A cock crew. Eugene went quietly to a window and stood looking out. The great beast of night prowled softly about the house. The walls, the windows seemed to bend inward from the thrusting pressure of the dark. The low noise in the wasted body seemed almost to have stopped. It came infrequently, almost inaudibly, with a faint, fluttering respiration. Eliza sat there stiffly and primly like a little child. Swarming pity rose in him. Gently, desperately, he tried to detach her fingers from Ben's hand. Her rough clasp on the cold hand tightened. Then slowly, stonily, from right to left, without expression, she shook her head. He fell back, beaten, weeping before that implacable gesture. Suddenly, with horror, he saw that she was watching her own death, that the unloosening grip of her hand on Ben's hand was an act of union with her own flesh, that, for her, Ben was not dying, but that a part of her life, her blood, her body was dying. Part of her, the younger, the lovelier, the better part, coined in her flesh, born and nourished and begun with so much pain there 26 years before, and forgotten since, was dying. Light faded from his brain and consciousness. Fatigue and powerful nervous depletion conquered him. He sprawled out on the floor with his arms pillowed on the bed, muttering drowsily. Eliza, unmoving, sat across the bed, holding Ben's hand. Eugene, mumbling, sank into an uneasy sleep. He awoke suddenly, conscious that he had slept, with a sharp quickening of horror. He was afraid that the little fluttering breath had now ceased entirely, that the effect of his prayer was lost. The body on the bed was almost rigid. There was no sound. Then, unevenly, without rhythm, there was a faint mutter of breath. He knew it was the end. He rose quickly and ran to the door. Across the hall, in a cold bedroom, on 2 wide beds, Gant, Luke, and Helen lay exhausted. "Come," cried Eugene. "He's going now." They came quickly into the room. Eliza sat unmoving, oblivious of them. As they entered the room, they heard, like a faint expiring sigh, the final movement of breath. The rattling in the wasted body, which seemed for hours to have given over to death all of life that is worth saving, had now ceased. The body appeared to grow rigid before them. Slowly, after a moment, Eliza withdrew her hands. But suddenly, marvelously, as if his resurrection and rebirth had come upon him, Ben drew upon the air in a long and powerful respiration. His gray eyes opened. Filled with a terrible vision of all life in the one moment, he seemed to rise forward bodilessly from his pillows without support. A flame, a light, a glory, joined at length in death to the dark spirit who had brooded upon each footstep of his lovely adventure on earth. And casting the fierce sword of his glance with utter and final comprehension upon the room, haunted with its gray pageantry of cheap loves and dull consciences, and on all those uncertain mummers of waste and confusion fading now from the bright window of his eyes, he passed instantly, scornful and unafraid as he had lived, into the shades of death. We can believe in the nothingness of life, we can believe in the nothingness of death and of life after death, but who can believe in the nothingness of Ben? Like Apollo, who did his penance to the high god in the sad house of King Admetus, he came, a god with broken feet, into the gray hovel of this world, and he lived here a stranger, trying to recapture the music of the lost world, trying to recall the great forgotten language, the lost faces, the stone, the leaf, the door.